Hi, Mahesh. Thank you very much for joining us. Um, and how is it over there? You are in Vietnam at the moment, I think.
It is fantastic, but almost unbearably hot.
Ooh, yes, Milo was telling me about how hot it is even in London. I feel like a common concern in this time is how hot it's becoming everywhere. The weather is pretty
Yes,
warm, unusually warm all across the world.
indeed.
Anyways, since we are running on a tight schedule, we will only have you for 50 minutes, but I would like to be in a good conversation with you for the time that we have. Allow me to introduce you very briefly, but before that, I'll just outline kind of what the session is about. First of all, this session is hosted by the Global Ideas Initiative, or the GII. And the GII is an independent platform. It's founded as a civil society platform in order to kind of investigate, champion inquiry on global governance challenges. So our job at the GII, or at least what we aspire to do, and we have been working towards, is to allow ideas from all across the world to kind of come together and understand more about the world around us at this moment and do research. You can join us and take a look at our website later on if you would like to know more. So later on in this session, we will have a Q&A function. At that time, the recording will be off, so do not feel worried about your privacy. Everything will be kept confidential from that moment onwards. And Mahesh, Uttamchandani, you are the World Bank's Regional Practice Director for Digital and AI in East Asia and the Pacific and the South Asia regions. And you have a very, very impressive set of roles. And I would just like to highlight that you are a very accomplished educator and author. You've lectured at universities worldwide, including, you know, I've seen your name at the flagship World Development Report in 2022. And we're so glad to have you, Mahesh. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christopher. It's my pleasure, and congratulations on the GII initiative. It's, I think, just such a timely thing to do. It's fantastic to see, if you don't mind me saying, younger generation taking the reins for leading a dialogue like that. So I look forward to our discussion today.
Well, yes, of course, Mahesh. I'm planning for this dialogue between us to be rather relaxed, but that is not to say we will not have interesting topics come up because I do want to know more about you and your work, and I'm sure the audience does too. So, for our first part, as you may know, this will be divided into roughly three segments. Um, in your time at the World Bank, or even before that, in wherever you have been exposed to AI as a technology, I just want to know what are the more interesting ways that you have seen AI benefit local populations in Asia or the Asia region or just in general? I just want to hear interesting stories.
Sure. I mean, just for context, what we do in this space in the bank is we provide financing and advisory services to emerging market and developing countries on their digital transformation. And I would say as recently as 18 months ago, most of the conversations I was having were around the deployment of fiber optic cable, right? In a lot of countries, particularly counterintuitively, I think, for many people in East Asia and the Pacific, for example, you have the largest cohort of unconnected people outside of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And people think of East Asia, I think they think of very digitally advanced societies, and there's lots of good reason for that. Of course, South Korea is here, Singapore is here, Japan is here, China is here. But you still have large cohorts of unconnected people, particularly in some of the archipelago type countries, right?
Mm.
Philippines, Indonesia. Um, and so most of the conversations were around extending that connectivity. Those conversations are still going on, but there has been a dramatic change in the nature of conversations I'm having with policymakers. Excuse me, where AI, I think, is dominating these conversations. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it is a uniquely fast-moving technology, right? And developing countries are already um, in the midst of this. So ChatGPT reached half the world's middle-income countries within just 6 months of its launch, right? Um, it reached 100 million users, I think, within 2 weeks of its launch. Compare that to 75 years for the telephone to reach 100 million users, or
Hmm.
even, I think, um, several years for the internet to reach that platform. So this is a fast diffusion rate technology with no precedent. It kind of outpaces any other previous general purpose technology that we know of, right? So in
Yes.
Nigeria and Kenya, for example, Gen AI adoption surged from 5% in 2023 to approximately 40% in 2025. That matches the adoption rate in the United States. And I think that's the interesting thing here, right? The overarching story of AI is that for the developing world, it is arriving at the same time as it is for more advanced economies. And what AI can do in a decade is what traditional development pathways would take maybe a century to achieve, right? One of AI's most distinctive features is its unique ability to perform non-routine cognitive tasks. And these are precisely the high-level skills that are chronically scarcest in low and middle income countries. So for decades, right, we have struggled with the reality that doctors, radiologists, specialized teachers, agronomists, even lawyers like myself are severely unavailable in rural and impoverished areas, right? And so rather than um, focus on the concern that AI may eliminate jobs, which is a legitimate concern in some sectors of many economies. I don't want to diminish that concern. In the developing country context, AI can fundamentally expand the supply of expertise that's in short supply, right? And so to come back to your question, we are seeing documented productivity gains of 40, 50% from AI adoption in areas like
Wow.
coding and software development. We are seeing, in the health sector, in Bangladesh, for example, AI assisted screening for diabetic retinopathy, which is a very preventable cause of blindness, has increased daily patient screening by about 40%. And because
Yeah.
AI models now routinely exceed human parity on PhD level science questions, the technology is quickly becoming highly credible in clinical decision support tool settings where medical specialists are really a luxury, right? So it allows local nurses and community health workers to safely deliver what you would call tier one diagnostic support and basically turning a basic rural clinic into an advanced triage center. So that's just one example,
Mhm.
right? In Singapore, the government's AI chatbot is estimated to have saved around 12,000 taxpayer hours in 2024 alone by streamlining interaction. So these are real world examples on the ground. Um, there is a company, there's a philanthropic organization in India that has developed AI powered TB screening that can detect TB through you coughing into your mobile phone, right?
Oh,
This
wow.
again,
Okay.
an entirely preventable or treatable disease that causes far too many deaths in India because it goes untreated. And what the AI can do is obviously it can't treat the disease. What it can do is it can identify the cases that then warrant further investigation and maybe to have someone travel to a hospital. But at the default setting is most people in rural India don't have access to those kinds of medical services. And so being able to remotely access this kind of diagnostic tool is a huge game changer.
Oh, that is really interesting. I wonder how it works, the system for recognizing TB through cuffing into your phone. But I think one of the questions that kind of arose in my mind when I was hearing all of this is that it's really amazing that all of these actors in developing nations or just nations in Asia in general, they have begun to develop these AI powered and AI associated applications. But I want to kind of think about the question of access, since I'm sure you are much more experienced in this than I am, and you have had exposure to how these development pipelines work. In my impression, a lot of the language models that we use, or just models in general, are kind of centered towards an Anglophone or maybe Sinophone audience. For those wanting to develop applications that have an intended audience of, say, a more obscure language, How have you seen people tackle the issue of like perhaps increased inaccuracies in language model outputs? I'd like to know.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And look, if we think about large language models as the paradigm, then you're quite right. There's a handful of countries in the world um, that are really resourced well enough to develop some of these large language models. And when we think about deployment of AI, I kind of think of it along three dimensions, right? There's the compute power, there's the data that you need to train the models, and there's the skills that you need in the people working on this. And if you look across all those three dimensions, there are a handful of countries that would be well resourced in all three spaces, right? So it is a problem. Um, I think we are also, though, thinking that large language models are not the only AI models that are going to be deployed at scale to solve thorny development issues. And in fact, um, in many cases, that's not the answer, right? So we have increasingly begun to focus on what our president calls small AI, which are kind of task specific, low resource AI models that can be used at the frontier of development. So they can be designed specifically for local dialects, limited bandwidth, constrained hardware, and this is already being deployed successfully in agriculture, in health, and education. And it's not a technical compromise, right? It's a deliberate, highly effective design philosophy appropriate to local context. And it allows developing countries to bypass the need for massive, kind of expensive, I would say, Western hosted server farms and to deal with a specific small model that you can train in a local language, right? Much
Mhm.
easier than you can train a large language model for kind of general purpose use. But I think that, coming back to your broader point about access, I think again, if we think along those three dimensions, um, the foundational skills gap in developing countries also creates a big challenge, right?
Yeah.
In sub-Saharan Africa, 89% of 10-year-olds could not read a simple text in 2023, right? So AI has to be introduced into these environments in a way where you recognize that foundational literacy is still being built. And you still in many of these countries see, for example, a gap in smartphone access, right? So only about little less than two-thirds of adults in low-income countries own any mobile phone. And when you control for smartphone ownership, that number drops to about 20%. So it's
Mm.
precisely why you need to actually leverage voice-based, low bandwidth, multi-language, as you say, AI tools. And this is not like a niche design consideration. This is the central design consideration, right? So if I look in India, the largest farmer cooperative in the world is in India. It's called Amul, and they have developed an agriculture-based platform for access by farmers from basic feature phones, not from smartphones, where the farmer can speak into the phone in her local language and get advice on crops, get advice on disease treatment, get advice on weather back in her local language, right? That is a small AI, and I don't mean small in impact. I mean small in the way the model is structured, um, in almost like a closed loop, so you limit hallucinations. It's fed data from multiple sources through open APIs, and it is then translated into multiple local languages, but it can be deployed at scale in low bandwidth environments. So I think those are the kinds of solutions that we need to think about.
Those are very interesting. I'd like to know more about the exact kind of role that the World Bank or you perhaps play in the development of these, because I'm noticing you know a lot of these projects, and I wonder if you've collaborated with them, and if so, how? Because I've been meaning to get involved with projects like these, and I think it's really admirable that you do what you do, and I just want to know kind of a little bit about your job description. How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've launched an initiative called AgriConnect, which is not just about AI. It's about connecting farmers to information and markets and um, helping turn the job of farming into something that is much more sustainable for people in developing countries. And part of that is a technology layer, right? And so in Uttar Pradesh, in India, in other parts of the world, we are working on these technologies, and they're based on the principle of using the kind of what we call the kind of agri stack of data, right? So you often have digital identification in a country. You often have details on land ownership and on crops being farmed. And if you can digitize all of that data that can then be fed into the model so that a particular farmer, when she accesses this platform, the information is already framed around the crops she's growing, around what, where her land that she's farming is, so you can control the pest information that's given, the weather information that's given, and ultimately potentially even give her access to more open markets where she can make the decision about whether to sell her crop to a local cooperative, or to sell it in more distantly on the open market. She can access seed and other fertilizer inputs in a more open and transparent market, right? And all of this is enabled by technology, right?
Yes.
To try to do this in an analog way would be extremely difficult and expensive. And I think the technology can underpin all this. Now, having said all that, we obviously, with all of this technology, we have to put guardrails in place, right? There have to be
Yes.
consumer protection regulations. There has to be um, literacy training. There has to be all of these things. So I don't want to sound naive about it. What I'm trying to say is that the technology enables a level of customization and scale that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in other environments.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing from kind of your brief reflection on consumer protection and stuff is that there's a narrative in certain circles that kind of frames AI from the perspective of the consumer. And I think it's very true that AI as a product, it promises to do a lot of things. It promises to transform entire industries. It can help uplift those in underprivileged positions, farmers, as you mentioned. But one of the things that came to my attention recently is this idea of development stakeholdership, right? We know that as a product, we can give access to AI products to increasingly more and more people, given access to smartphones, access to internet, even despite gaps that you may have mentioned. But what are your thoughts on developing nations and AI developers in those regions? Do you think that those nations are getting enough coverage? Are there enough, you know, developers who are passionate enough to build AI products for people in those regions?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you definitely see this around the world. I think everywhere I go, you see all of this energy, particularly in younger people, um, and a lot of skill, right? A lot of focus. I mean, I'm in Vietnam right now as we speak, and there's so much focus on science and math education that there is a very skilled cohort of young people that are doing this kind of work. But I do think it's important that we continue to push to hear underrepresented voices kind of in the AI space, right? And so if I think of like the lowest, of the lowest, to say 25 low income countries in the world, I think only Rwanda has published a dedicated AI strategy, right?
Mm, yeah.
Um, Whereas if you compare that to high income countries, probably half of them have developed AI strategies, and many have kind of legally binding AI frameworks in place. And so the norms are being set in the global north, right? Whereas, you know, I think a lot of the interesting work and use cases are happening in the global south, and we have to try and manage that mismatch and make sure the voice of the global south is heard, right? Um, and I think, this can manifest in all sorts of different ways, when you think about things like, data sovereignty, and
Yes.
how countries are dealing with data protection legislation. But I think the bottom line, to answer your question, is that there is so much, there are so many countries in the global south with youth bulges, and that they are able to leverage these, this cohort of youth. um, it's going to be transformational for these economies. But education is a big part of this, and you've really got to invest in human capital and in skilling, and in addressing the skills gap in that educational cohort. And again, I'm sitting in Vietnam that has made remarkable transformations in the semiconductor industry, in the software industry, and most of that starts with education.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. I've heard the term digital literacy, that's a very common one, but now we're seeing AI literacy more and more commonly. So I'd like to hear your stance about kind of how do we insert artificial intelligence awareness or education into, say, like existing education curricula? Because this is a topic that has been under debate quite a lot about the involvement of AI in education. And say within the context of Asia, or perhaps for the sake of the topic of this a discussion for underrepresented or underprivileged communities, how do you see AI be put into education systems?
I'm very far from being an education specialist, but I can just tell you anecdotally, I don't think this is just a global South problem. I have two children in university in North America, and what I see, and I have sympathy for this, but what I see is that the universities are very focused on managing for AI as a tool for cheating, right? And I
Yes.
completely understand that. I think there's a lot of integrity and fairness issues at play, but I think we have to move from a policing of AI approach in higher education to encouraging more interaction and use and training of AI, right? And
Mm,
again, the challenge here is we're all facing these same challenges at once. There isn't a roadmap. There isn't, well, this is how country X did it, and so I'm just going to kind of follow that and tailor it for my local needs. This is hitting all of us at the same time. And so I don't pretend to have the answers. I'm very sympathetic to the challenges that educational institutions have to manage in terms of integrity of their processes. But I think we run the risk of, again, focusing on the policing aspect and not on how to increase productivity in a way, through really teaching young people how to use these tools.
yeah. Yeah, I think that was also what I was kind of getting at. Perhaps to be more specific, um, in certain places around the world, we have digital literacy classes. Do you see AI literacy classes becoming kind of a staple of modern education in the near future? And how do you see that being executed? Like, um, what parts of AI do you think it's important for people to learn more about at an earlier age?
I think, just to deviate for 1 second, I think one of the most important things we need to educate people on in general at all ages is the disinformation risk, right?
Yes, yeah.
I think this is a threat to social cohesion. It can be uniquely dangerous in countries that lack the institutional capacity to counter it. So if the I forget this data point, but the entire continent of Africa, I think, has something like 65 fact-checking organizations for a population of 1.5 billion people. So that's kind of one fact-checking organization for every 23 million citizens, right? So
Wow.
AI generated deep fakes, voice cloning, synthetic media are all already being deployed for disinformation in the global south. And I don't know, how some countries have tried to pass laws that require watermarks very visibly to be displayed on AI generated videos. I mean, that can be a good start. Again, how you police that is not clear to me. Bad actors will always be bad actors, and so how you control for that is not clear. So I think we need that level of education of news literacy, right? And information literacy. But then moving to your question, I think to me the answer is to always focus more on situationally specific training, right? So I don't know that there's general purpose AI training that that is going to be incredibly useful to people. Maybe prompt engineering, um, but even look, even prompt drafting has become something that people use AI for. Vibe coding has changed the way, in a very short time, we approach coding issues, right, to make them
Yeah.
more accessible. So I really don't have the answer to this. I agree with you that it's critical. But how we integrate, I mean, look, I think if we fast forward 20 years or 15 years, this is going to be incorporated in primary school education the way that basic literacy and numeracy is incorporated. I think the question is, what do we do
Mm.
between here and now, right? Where
Yeah.
educators are learning this the way you and I are learning this by using it, just trial and error. It's changing every day. So I think we're actually in a very unstable period in a sense where it's hitting all of us at the same time. We're trying to figure it out as we go, and turning that into a pedagogical approach um to training. I just don't know. I don't know how we do it. I'll tell you very candidly, what I encourage my staff to do is to not wait for some top-down training program and to just learn by doing. Be pioneers through learning by experimenting, and that's not terribly efficient, but I think it's the only way at this point.
Oh, that is very insightful. I think I wanted to revisit what you said earlier when you briefly mentioned data sovereignty, because it just come to my attention as well that this is a very important issue that kind of puts a risk to the fact that the majority of large AI developers are based in more developed nations, while not so many are in developing nations. And I read about things like the Treaty of Waitangi from New Zealand. Are you aware of that?
I'm not, no.
Well, I think if I may have a kind of a brief description, the Treaty of Waitangi is this treaty. I think since it's from New Zealand, it deals with the among other things, data sovereignty of the Maori people. So it kind of outlines the different ways in which Maori identity, especially like digital identity and data that comes from the Maori, such as the Maori language, how it should be protected and how it should be used according to the will of the Maori people. And it was definitely a perspective on data ownership and data sovereignty um, that was new to me. And I was thinking, kind of based off of that, maybe rather short description, do you see this occurring in other kind of communities? Is it important to outline um, in more explicit ways how data uh, from say, underrepresented nations can get used or utilized by, say, AI models from larger companies like OpenAI or Anthropic?
So I can't opine on that specific situation. What I can tell you is I think what we are advising governments to consider, right, is how do you classify data in a very practical and sensible way, and to really tier the classification based on risk, based on um, I mean, primarily based on risk, so that not all, data sovereignty is something you can achieve um, through proper data classification. So you may have very high risk and sensitive data that, for example, needs to stay onshore and cannot flow out of your country to a hyperscaler data center that might be offshore, right? But
Yes.
if you classify all of your data that way, then there are necessary trade-offs you're going to experience in the value you can extract from that data, right? Because if it can't get commingled with some of these models that exist in these large data centers, right? Um, then there is a necessary limitation to what you can do with that data, right? I'm not saying
Mm,
that's
yes.
not a norm, that's not right or wrong, but it's important that policymakers consider what that not all data is the same, right? Um, and there are trade-offs in how you classify and how you keep, for example, keep some of this data onshore, and to be cognizant of those trade-offs, right? Those should be conscious policy decisions grounded in a legitimate objective, not a knee-jerk reaction to, the way the political winds are blowing, right? I think
Yes.
that's the important conversation to have. And that, requires a degree of technical sophistication and understanding, when I let go, when I permit some of the less sensitive data to flow offshore, what does that mean, right? What's going to happen
Yes.
to it? Who owns it? How do I access it? And increasingly, some of the large hyperscalers are offering kind of sovereign data clouds within their data centers, right? So there are ways to achieve a degree of security and sovereignty, um, without necessarily having to build, for example, your own government data center in the basement of the building of this ministry in this country, which becomes, I think, harder to maintain the security of. It becomes harder to
Yeah.
main, it's not necessarily economically efficient. So there are a number of considerations, right? And there will, I think, for most countries, there will always be a degree of data that you really need to treat very securely, and you need to store locally, and you don't necessarily want to put it on somebody else's cloud. But again, just to think through and what the concentric circles look like, right? So that how do you classify this data, I think, is really important.
So then would you say as a whole, just briefly, that um, perhaps the most effective way forward for AI is to allow for, say, these like large companies or large stakeholders to be the ones developing AI, but as long as we treat the data with care, as long as we allow for those, say, those specialized clouds, as you mentioned, that data sovereignty could be upheld?
Well, I don't know that I would put it that way. I think, it's not a question of letting these large companies develop models. I think it's a question of where, as a policymaker, do you want to put your scarce resources, right?
Mm,
And I don't know that in country X, that is, let's say, a low income or fragile country, it makes sense to say we are going to invest all of these resources in developing our own competitor to, um, one of the large AI companies' models, right? I don't know
yes.
that, how achievable that is. I don't know how good a use of resources is, right? When I talk to governments, I think we think of governments playing three pretty distinct roles, but simultaneously. They've got to become enablers, they've got to become users, and they've got to become regulators, right? And they have to do all these things, um, at the same time. So, as enablers, they have to invest heavily in basic infrastructure. Basic infrastructure, depending on what your country looks like, may be, you know, providing smartphones to, or subsidizing smartphone access to your population. It is still going to be fiber and connectivity. It may be local data centers for highly sensitive data. But as users, governments need to actually become users of AI to modernize public services, right? Reach more citizens. The examples we were talking about in health and education and agriculture earlier. And then as regulators, they have to fiercely protect their citizens through smart regulation, right? Not knee-jerk policies, but smart regulation. And so if you think of doing all these things in parallel, for any government, this is an immense administrative challenge, right? You are learning as you are doing, skills are in short supply. And I think it requires very deliberate sequencing, being ruthless about prioritization, and probably a willingness to break down, what might have been deeply entrenched sort of siloed structures across government departments and
Mm.
ministries to create a unified digital perspective or a unified digital policy that cuts across ministries and topics. So I think these are the challenges for government, right? And then how that plays out on the ground in practice is going to look very different across different countries.
Yeah, I think That's very much true. A lot of things have to change within governments or even intergovernmental organizations, structurally speaking, as you mentioned, in order to accommodate a lot of the changes that we're seeing. And that kind of ties into one of the questions that I was asked by Raj, who's from Singapore, but was unfortunately unable to make it. On that note, I think for time's sake, if if any of you have questions, feel free to ask them um, in the messages area. But to recall what Raj was asking me, he wanted me to relay this to you because he could not make it. Given that there are so many changes that might have to happen within government structures or policies, within your area of jurisdiction in Asia, do you think that Asian nations, underrepresented Asian nations especially, but also Asian nations as a whole, are they on pace to achieve kind of stakeholder equity or just a general good standing with AI? At the moment, do you think that in the near future, the World Bank will be pleased with how AI has turned out in the region?
I mean, again, I think this is such an open question for all countries, not just in the global south, not just in this region. I will say that this, that East Asia and the Pacific is a highly heterogeneous region, right?
Mm.
As I said earlier, we have, very advanced digital societies like South Korea and Singapore. We have fragile countries, I'm thinking particularly some of the Pacific Islands, and we have all points in between, right? Um, and I think that international cooperation is not kind of an optional nice to have in this space. It's going to be a strict necessity. I don't think any single
Mm.
developing country, well, very few single developing countries have the market power, the technical capacity, or the data resources to shape AI alone. And so thinking through regional approaches, like shared computing infrastructure, cross-border data governance agreements, are going to be essential in this part of the world and in most parts of the world for low income and middle income countries to engage kind of on a equal footing in these topics. So I think for us as a development organization, that's where we are also focusing. We've been honored to be trusted by the ASEAN digital ministers as a development
Mm.
partner in ASEAN. And I think we want to continue to work with governments to build the technical and regulatory capacity that's needed to negotiate through this transition. And this means for us as an institution, and I think for other multilateral development banks, to embed AI governance support directly into our country partnerships, directly into our financing, and continue to finance digital infrastructure because this is what will underpin access for so many people in the developing world, but also to invest in human capital, right? That allows governments to be informed buyers and regulators of AI, not
Mhm.
just passive recipients. I think that's really the important thing here, right? Is to help governments be informed actors here and not just takers of what's coming in the AI space. But to do that in a way that is doesn't squander resources on chasing things in the latest shiniest and newest thing in AI that you read in the you know, on the front pages of the newspaper. It's about using resources smartly to deliver value to your citizens.
Wow, that's very thought-provoking. I think I I had this conversation with Raj, right? And Raj currently he's an aspiring entrepreneur in Singapore. And he tells me, he phrases it this way, that entrepreneurs in Singapore are wishing to catch, I quote, the AI tailwinds that are reaching Singapore. And to this, I wanted to ask you kind of in general, how do you see the private sector playing a role? Because as of now, we have mostly been talking within the context of like farmers unions in India where we've been talking about intergovernmental frameworks for AI policy, helping build those relationships. But there are lots of entrepreneurs around me at Stanford and also people like Raj who are very interested to ask about in what way do you see the private sector in Asia kind of shaping the landscape of the future for AI in the region?
I mean, I think so much of digital transformation is driven by the private sector, right? Um, I think that so much of the innovation that we see in this space, close to all of the innovation we see in this space, is of course driven by the private sector. I think where government plays an important role is in providing the enabling foundations on which the private sector can innovate. So, an analogy, if you kind of go back a few years to how fintech has developed, right? Often, not always, but often government would provide payment rails on which then the private sector would come and offer innovative products. And so if I translate that to where we're going in the digital space, and I think about what we have come to call digital public infrastructure, which is, digital identification, payments, and data exchange. These are often public rails, if you will, that the government builds, and then the private sector comes and puts the trains on the rails and provides all of, a lot of the innovation. So I think in order to do that, you kind of have to be in sync about the direction you want to travel, right? The rails have to go in the direction that you want to travel, and there are certain elements that are kind of public goods, and that's the job of government. But then to get out of the way and let the private sector come in and innovate, right? And so if you look at digital identification in India, for example, Aadhaar, which has onboarded, 1.2, 1.3 billion people to a national biometric digital identification scheme. Um, on top of that, you have all sorts of services being offered by the private sector. If you look at SingPass in Singapore, right, which
Yes,
is
yeah, yeah.
Singapore's national digital identification, that is provided by the government as a public good. And then, of course, banks can do electronic KYC. Companies can provide other services. Your mobile phone company can verify your identity. All of these things that are done by the private sector, right? Um, so the responsibility of government, in my view, is to interact and interface with the private sector that way, and to provide the necessary guardrails, the consumer protection, data privacy, data protection tools, but then let the private sector come and innovate. And I think that
Yeah.
model in general works very well. I do think that sort of, I'll say this because you're sitting in Palo Alto, that move fast and break things mantra is a little bit incompatible with AI in the context of high stakes public systems, right? Um, so if you think about, you know, AI being used to allocate welfare benefits, to flag tax fraud, to triage hospital patients in the developing world, these are sensitive public contexts. And errors are not minor software bugs that you kind of casually patch in the next update and then you move on, right? These are severe real world harms that are going to actually hurt people. And so we have to advocate in those contexts, right? Fit for purpose rules that are rigorous about testing, evaluating before we go to scale. So one of the things we are working on with a number of governments is AI sandboxes. And this builds on a model that we all know well from the financial sector, which is before you put digitally enabled financial products out there, you often test them in a safe and controlled environment to make sure
Yeah.
they're safe for consumers' use. You don't just put them out in the market, figure out what the mistakes are, patch the mistakes, and kind of move on, right? And I think for high stakes public sector use of AI, that kind of testing and sandboxing is so critical.